Welcome, listeners. I hope your day is going brilliantly. And guess what? I have a very special episode for you today. A guest narrator that is going to blow your minds. I have the fantastically creepy and let's not meet true story guru of terror, Andy Tate, from the Let's Not Meet podcast, a true horror podcast. If you've not heard of him yet, you'll get to hear him on today's episode, and I'm sure you'll be convinced to visit, listen, and subscribe to his channel. And here's why. I reached out to Andy because of three main reasons. A stunningly creepy voice that caught my ear, a passion for true creepy stories, and his love for old-time radio stations. It's listening to him that inspired me to share those two stories with you yesterday, and the day before. Andy covers true Let's Not Meet stories, and recently he started airing old-time suspense horror radio. Now, real talk here, listeners. I got into podcasting because of my own love for these old-school radio stations. They inspired me to bring stories to your ears. Honestly, these stories have a soft spot in my heart, and makes Andy Tate's podcast even more special. So what does this mean for you lovely listeners? It means I have a jam-packed episode of Let's Not Meet stories, co-narrated by the Let's Not Meet guru himself, Andy Tate. Can you tell I'm excited? So let's turn off the lights, turn up the sound, and get ready to welcome our guest.
Hunted on the Pacific Crest Trail. This story ended up being much longer than I had originally anticipated, and I apologize for the long read. This story occurred in the summer of 2008. I grew up in Oregon and was acquainted with the outdoors at an early age. My favorite hobby became hiking, particularly in areas that are either very dangerous or isolated. The health benefits of hiking were secondary to the thrills of walking the edges of exposed cliffs, being in cougar and bear territory, and knowing that I was far, far from help. Into the Wild was released in the fall of 2007, and I immediately fell in love. Being a high school senior, I could barely go another week living with my parents. The movie spoke to my sense of adventure and inspired me to hike the California portion of the Pacific Crest Trail upon graduation. I made it from the Mexico border to Northern California without much incident. I saw rattlesnakes, black bears, and experienced dehydration, but nothing happened that made me fear for my life. Somewhere in the Lassen National Forest in northeastern California, I walked around a bend in the trail, only to be startled by two people sitting on a rock dressed in nearly all white. Their faces were dirty, their appearance was disheveled, and the man had a long, unkempt beard. Both seemed to be in their 40s. They looked like the couple that kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. What struck me as odd about the encounter was encountering anybody at all. I frequently went days without seeing a single human being. Their white clothes could be explained away by the need to escape the California summer sun. Their scruffy appearance could be explained away by the fact that most thru hikers abandon personal hygiene on the trail. After I said hello, they said nothing and simply watched me as I passed. Even that I didn't find odd. I chalked it up to them being foreign or not knowing what to say. I camped a few hundred yards off the trail that night, as I always did. Following bear precautions, I hung the leftover food I had cooked that night from a tree approximately 5 feet off the ground. Packing up camp in the morning, I noticed the food wasn't there. I immediately thought a bear had entered my campsite, and so I began to look for paw prints. I didn't find paw prints, but I did find boot prints circling the campsite, 2 pairs of them. Only one of those prints led right up to the rope from which the food was hanging. I thought of the couple that I had passed earlier and everything clicked. I quickly packed up and left. My mind was racing the entire day, but I figured the couple was simply hungry. If they had nefarious intentions, they would have come for more than the food. Several days passed, and my mind was at ease again. I had begun to circle my campsite with sticks to wake me in the event of an intruder, animal, or anything otherwise. I awoke in my tent one night to the sound of those sticks crunching. I grabbed my hunting knife. I tried to relax by telling myself that in the middle of nowhere, the source of that noise is much more likely an animal than a person. I heard frantic whispering. It was impossible to tell which direction the voices were coming from. Being in the dark, surrounded by trees, 100 miles from the nearest city plays tricks on your senses. I debated yelling out, claiming that I had a gun, but instead decided to be silent and retain the benefit of surprise. I heard footsteps circling my tent, and I was ready to slash. But just like that, it was over. No more footsteps, no more whispering. I lied frozen, awake in my tent until sunrise, and opened my tent to find nobody there. The only evidence something had actually happened were the boot prints, the same ones as before. Several more days passed, and I was now in Shasta National Forest, probably 50 to 75 miles from where I first encountered the couple. The trail became more or less a goat trail. Being on the side of the mountain and above the tree line, I could see the trail winding for miles in front of and behind me. I stopped for water in the rare shade and noticed 2 hikers miles behind me. All I could see were 2 white dots moving along the mountainside. I immediately said out loud, "Fuck this trip is over." I pulled out my map and looked for the nearest town, which appeared to be Castella, located off I-5. The only problem was that it was 25 miles away. I hiked well into the night, trying to gain as much ground as possible. I kept losing the trail and decided to set up camp, this time far off the trail and into the forest. I got in my tent and tried to sleep, but every little noise kept me awake. After a few hours in my tent, I heard the telltale signs of another bad night. The footsteps, the whispering, the sticks breaking. Sound travels far in the absence of other sound. I knew they were close, but I wasn't sure how close. All I could think of was, this is fucked up. This is so fucked up. God damn it. Finally, a flashlight hits my tent. It lights up everything and goes dark. I unzipped my tent and climbed out, carrying my knife, yelling nonsense into the dark. It was sort of like that cliche scene in movies where people in the wilderness hear sticks breaking around them and the camera pans around to the trees because the people have no idea which direction the sound is coming from. Then I heard footsteps running towards the tent and barely made out a figure moving in my peripheral vision. I turned and ran deep into the forest. I tripped several times and ran into several trees. After running for approximately 5 minutes, I tripped, rolled, and came to rest next to a downed tree. I got under the tree trunk and laid still. I saw the flashlight moving around in the distance. I laid under the tree for hours. I was certain they were gone, but I didn't move. Eventually, birds started chirping, and I knew sunrise would come soon. Once it did, I made my way back to the trail, abandoned my campsite, and walked the rest of the distance to Castella, where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses I-5. I hitchhiked my way back to the town of Mount Shasta and spoke with the police and forest services. They put me up in a motel for the night, and my parents drove from Oregon to pick me up the next day. I followed up with the police and the Forest Service months later, who told me there had been similar reports of items disappearing from campsites throughout the surrounding national forests. However, there had been no other reports of the terrorizing that I had experienced. As far as I know, nothing ever came of the couple. Never sleep in your car. These events occurred in September of 2011 when I was 19 years old. Growing up, I was always a bit of an intellectual, and I liked doing tests and experiments on myself. weird things that other people wouldn't find interesting, you know? I would see how many consecutive hours I could stay up without falling asleep, or see how long I could go without eating before minor hunger pains set in, things like that. It sounds extreme, I know, but it really wasn't. I never got out of control. For some reason, when I was 19, I became fascinated with the homeless and what it would be like to be homeless. It was a concept that I simply couldn't get my head around. Not having someplace to go to when the day was over seemed so foreign. I decided I wanted to experience it somehow. I wanted the experience to be as authentic as possible, but obviously still safe. I decided to pack up my car with essentials like water, dry cereal, and stuff like that. I drove from where I grew up in Central Florida all the way to the middle of Arkansas, in its capital city of Little Rock. It took me about 14 hours or something. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Little Rock, but it's very rural for being the largest city in the entire state. I wanted to be far enough away from home that I couldn't chicken out, to make things more authentic. I brought just enough money for gas and potential emergencies. The plan was to live in my car for 2 weeks in a large, nearly empty parking lot outside of the Bill Clinton Presidential Library. I made an audio entry into my phone describing the day's events for the first few days, but stopped after it got boring. For the first week or so, nothing really happened. I went to the library to use the bathroom, etc., and slept in my car at night. I listened to the radio and played guitar, just trying to fill the days with something. The nights were a little frightening because I could sometimes see real homeless people, and I started to feel a sense of dread every day when I saw the sun setting. One night after I'd been out there for about a week, things got really scary. I was sleeping in the driver's seat, with the seat reclined all the way back. I went to sleep about 11. I woke up at 12 when I heard a car pulling up next to me. I ignored it and kept my eyes closed, trying to fall back to sleep. I had my windows cracked half an inch for ventilation. I heard the windows of the car come down, and a voice said, "Hey, man." I don't know how he even saw me in there. I straightened up and saw a white male about 30 years old with a baseball cap on. He looked very thin. When he had my attention, he spoke in a slightly southern accent. "Hey, man. What are you doing there?" I gave him a half-asleep look as if to say, "What do you think?" He started looking at me funny. "So you're just going to spend the night there?" I nodded, and he looked at me for a few more seconds before saying, "All right, man," and driving away. I didn't think much of it. I even thought maybe he was a concerned citizen, so I just went back to sleep. About 30 minutes pass, and I hear a car pull up next to me again. Guess what? It's the same guy. He looks at me weird again, and I look at him like, just leave me alone. He rolls down his window and says, "Hey, man, I'm looking for somebody around here. Somebody with the big dick. You know anybody like that?" At this point, I'm really pissed because I think he's playing a joke at my expense. I look at him like, what the hell? And he looks really serious, but I just continue to glare at him. He says, "All right, man, sorry," and waits about a minute and drives off again. Obviously, at this point, I should have left, but I didn't know of any other place to park, and I was really tired, so I just went back to sleep. Big mistake. The parking lot was absolutely deserted at this time. It's a huge parking lot, so there was no one even close to being within an earshot of he and I. A while later, I wake up, but I can tell that it's still dark outside, so I'm still trying to sleep. I hear a tiny little sound, like someone is scratching the outside of my car. I crack my eyes and see the man standing outside of my car. But that's not all. There are 4 other men standing outside my car. I realize the sound I hear is them quietly trying to open my car doors without waking me. To my horror, I noticed one of the men has his penis out and he's jerking it around as if he's trying to get it hard. At this point, one of them notices and yells, "He's awake!" And they all start banging on the windows and screaming at me as I fumble with the keys and try to get the car started. They're screaming, calling me names, and telling me about how they're going to run a train on me and rape me. I'm totally freaked out, but I get the car started right away. Luckily, all my doors were locked. They're jumping on the car as I reverse it quickly, and I can hear body parts crunching under the tire and someone screaming in pain. As I backed up, I saw one man's leg was crumbled in half. One of them was still on top of the car, pounding on the windshield. I just kept going. I left the parking lot and started towards the highway before he finally jumped off, screaming obscenities at me as if I were the one who did something wrong. I'm shaking and I can feel my eyes bulging out of my face. Suddenly wide awake, I drove however many hours straight until I got to my aunt's house in Atlanta. I never told anyone this story until now. It feels good to tell you guys. I've thought about it so many times. I've never felt so terrified by anything, real or fake, in my life. Just knowing there are people out there that are so evil, it's unsettling. Thank you for reading about my experience and stay safe. Obviously, living in your car, if you have other options, is incredibly stupid. Flashing Headlights by Reddit user Queen of Chaos. Let me start off by saying that this is my first post on Reddit. I've been lurking on this subreddit for a few months, and I finally decided to share my own creepy encounter. Sorry if it's a little lengthy. This story takes place about 9 years ago. I was around 15 years old at the time. I am a 5'5" female. Back in high school, I was athletic. I was on my high school dance team, and I've always been pretty attractive to the opposite sex. Being on the dance team at school meant that I was also required to perform at football and basketball games during halftime. This was how a boy, we will call him Derek, began to notice me. Derek was from another school in the district, and he was a few years older. I had never seen him, but apparently he took notice of me. I received a friend request on MySpace later that night. He said he had seen me at the game and thought I was extremely beautiful. He also said he just wanted to get to know me better. Being a young teenage girl at the time, I was flattered. It wasn't really uncommon for guys from different high schools to message me, considering that there are 3 high schools within 30 minutes of each other. The county I live in is relatively small, so friends of mine knew the guy and didn't see any red flags. Thus, about a month of talking online began. We talked every day, got to know each other, but there was never anything sexual said. He would compliment my looks and made it very clear that he was interested in a relationship. I, however, was not interested. He was attractive, but I had my reservations. In the way he talked, he acted way more serious than I was prepared for. After a while, though, he asked me to go to a movie. I agreed and we scheduled a day and time. The day before I was supposed to meet him at the movies, I began to have second thoughts because I just had an off feeling about it. My friend, let's call her Cassie, and I devised a plan that I would cancel with him and tell him I was going to another city about an hour away to hang out with my friend instead. I'm generally a very nice person, and I don't like to hurt people's feelings, so I asked for a rain check. He agreed, though disappointed. I was so relieved, even though I couldn't put my finger on as to why I felt so much better. Instead of going to another city, though, Cassie and I stayed around our town and went to the movies there. Let me say one thing. Derek and Cassie did not know each other. They had never met. She didn't even know who he was. The entire movie was fine. We laughed and talked, typical teenage girl things. All was well. After the movie, we got into Cassie's car and began to drive home. We passed our local Burger King, and a car dashes out behind us. I thought nothing of it at the time because we were both used to typical hillbilly drivers in our hometown. That's when things got weird, though. We started traveling up the lower road to get to my house, and we notice a car is tailing us. And by tailing, I mean that if she would have tapped on the brake, we would have been rear-ended. Within 30 seconds of time, the car behind us turns their high beams on and starts flashing their lights and honking. This went on for a couple of miles. Being two 15 to 16-year-old girls, naturally we were a little scared. We just tried to keep calm and try to find a logical explanation. We live in a rural town, and we figured maybe the driver just needed to get by us. Up the road, there was a little convenience store off to the side. We figured it would be okay to pull off and let the driver by. The area was well lit, so it felt to be a safer option. Keep in mind, I live in a southern city, and up in what we call the hollers, there is hardly any cell phone reception. Anyway, we pull off to the side of the road, thinking the car would just go by, but that wasn't the case. The car pulls off behind us and comes to a stop about an inch away from the bumper of Cassie's car. We were frozen with fear. We sat facing forward. Cassie is panicking. I glance up in the rearview mirror in time to see Derek climbing out of the driver's seat. He makes his way over to the window of the car and taps on it. I look up, and he's staring at me. His lips slowly curve into a smile, and he motions for me to roll down the window. I do. He says, "Can you step out and talk to me for a second?" Not knowing what else to do, I stepped out of the car and turned to face him. He acted as though nothing he'd done this far was wrong. He just smiled and said, "You're even more beautiful up close." "How did you know who we were and which car was ours?" I said. He avoided my question. "I just wanted to see you and hug you." Before I could even respond, he pulled me into a hug. His clothes had a musty smell to them, and he felt damp from sweat. I pulled back and said, "Look, I'm sorry, but I really need to get home." I was scared out of my mind, for one reason being that apparently he had been watching me the entire time. And if that wasn't creepy enough, he had then tailed me about 20 minutes up the road, flashing his lights and honking his horn just to talk to me. His eyes went flat and distant when I said I needed to leave. He said, "You can't go anywhere unless you say yes to being my girlfriend." As he said this, he took a step closer and put his hand on my neck and grabbed some of my hair. Not hard, but I could tell he had a good grip on me. Needless to say, I was out of my mind in fear. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. I wanted to vomit. "So, what's it gonna be, baby cakes?" he said in a mocking tone, and he put his other hand on my chin and lifted my head. He had a strong grip. He grabbed my jaw, waiting for my answer. His eyes were bloodshot, and I would bet my life that he was doped up on some kind of drug. At this point, my adrenaline started kicking in. I began to think of any possible way I could get out of this situation and get to safety. I'm a small person, and he was around 6'3" and solid muscle. I knew I couldn't fight him off. So I went with my next option. Play along. I would love to, and I gave him the best, although looking back, probably not the most believable, smile I could muster, and gently reached up and touched his hand to pull it off my face. Thankfully to the heavens, this seemed to work. The life in his eyes perked back up, and he seemed to be genuinely happy. "Go home then. I'll see you soon, baby cakes." And he leaned down and kissed my forehead. As soon as he turned to go, I jumped in the car. Cassie threw it into gear, and we sped off. We turned a 15-minute trip into 5 and sped to my house. I signed into MySpace, sent him a message telling him how much he scared me and that I lied and wanted nothing to do with him. I said that if he ever came near me again, I would call the police. Then I blocked him from every social media site he had access to me on. I never heard from him directly again, but a few of my friends said that he messaged them every day trying to find out more information about me, and some would say they even seen him at games standing far away watching me. but nothing ever came of it. So creepy 5-minute boyfriend, let's not ever meet.
A Rest Stop for the Night by Operation Filth. About 3 weeks ago, my mum told my brother and I this story. Straight up gave me the yucky feeling. Sally is a lifelong family friend. Sally would frequently visit her friends and family in Oklahoma. We live in a small town in southern Ontario, Canada. Sally would drive straight 20 hours, at least overnight, to get from our town to another small town. She did this simply to save money, and obviously wanted to arrive as soon as she could. Now that you've got my prelude, here is the story. About 30 years ago, she decided to head south on a visit. No big deal, she's done this a few times. So she packs up and heads out. At some point after driving about 14 to 15 hours, she started getting pretty tired. Being as it was probably the 80s, it was a little safer. She decided that she would stop at a rest stop. It was more of a traveler's stop, my mum said, to sleep for a little bit and resume her drive first thing in the AM. She parks in a very well lit and busy rest stop. She parks right by the lights and felt at ease because there were an abundance of travelers stopping and going. She gets out, comes back, and settles in her car. About then, an RV pulls up beside her and an elderly couple get out. The man asks her about coming from Canada. They strike up a little conversation. Nothing odd. The couple talk to Sally for a bit. They tell her they are driving from the south, going north, and just needed to have a sleep for the night. They wanted to talk because they were unsure if a rest stop was okay to stop at, but seeing Sally there, they were at ease. They say goodnight and good trip, and the couple went back in their RV. Sally locked her doors up and went to sleep. 2 to 3 hours later, Sally woke up with a really unsettling feeling. She looked around. Nothing. A few people going in the stop. Parking lights are all on. She assumes she is feeling bad because she's tired, and a car isn't the best to sleep in. After 10 minutes, she said that this feeling actually got worse, and it was a jarring, queasy, uneasy feeling. She sits back and tries to shrug it off. This didn't work, and apparently, she had every red alarm and instinct telling her that she needs to go. She panics, starts her car and peels off. She doesn't care where, she just knew she had to get away from there. So, about 20 miles down the road, she finds a motel and a gas station, or restaurant stop. She decides to see if she could get a room for what little money she had. She converses with the person in charge. He cuts her a deal, as he doesn't want a young woman driving alone at night. She gets a key, pops in her hotel room and sleeps for the night. No issues, all in peace. Around 9 AM, she wakes up, showers, changes clothes, and decides to relax for a few. She turns on the TV, and what was on it actually gave me chills. There was a breaking news story about an elderly couple killed in the middle of the night. The news shows the RV that Sally was parked next to. Exact spot. Exact rest stop. And she sees the fast food drink cup she dropped on accident that rolled under her car. Sometime during the night, a man broke into their RV and killed them. Then left. Presumably, right before Sally had left. The man was never caught. Sally since then stopped at hotels for the night and avoided rest stops. The Breakfast Intruder by 10019245. First things first, this is not my story but my father's. Might be breaking the rules with that, but I thought I'd give it a go on here. This happened in the summer of 1993. My dad and his girlfriend, now my stepmother, were living in Cardiff, Wales, in the city centre. Not a particularly high crime area, a lot of student accommodation. I won't give the exact location, but there was a cafe nearby named The Warm as Toast Cafe, amusingly abbreviated on the front as TWAT. TWAT Cafe. Irrelevant to the story, but had to mention it. 6 a.m. my dad gets up and walks down to the kitchen to get his morning coffee. As he walks into the kitchen, he is welcomed by a random man sat at the kitchen table staring at him. Being the cool, collected guy he is, instead of freaking out, my dad asks the guy if he wants a cup of coffee. Breakfast intruder agrees and joins him. A few minutes later, my dad's girlfriend comes in. Also, doesn't freak out, and offers to make him some breakfast. So, the three of them sit down, have breakfast, and have a chat for 20 minutes or so. Apparently the conversation was a bit weird and nonsensical, but they didn't say what it was about. Breakfast finishes, and they escort breakfast intruder through the front door. After he leaves, they start freaking out and naturally call the police. Police come, take statements, etc. Later in the day, they're contacted by the police saying that they apprehended the breakfast intruder. Turns out the guy was a paranoid schizophrenic and was breaking into the odd-numbered houses on the street. My dad's was the second house he'd entered. The first house, next door, he had gone into was empty. This was where he left his tools, a sawn-off shotgun, and a lot of ammo. His plan was to shoot anyone in the odd-numbered houses on the street. When the police arrested him, he told them that my dad and his girlfriend were the nicest couple he'd ever met, and that has stopped him carrying out his plan. When people say I'm too laid back for my own good, I tell them this story, and it never fails to shut them up. Sandra from Across the Road by Oren Coco. For background, I live in rural Ireland, and this story begins when I was a child in the mid to late 90s and came to a head in 2015 when I was 21 years old. As I mentioned, I live in rural Ireland, in the Midlands to be exact. I'm the youngest of 6 kids and grew up in a pretty classic, traditional Irish Catholic family. As a child, I'd always been made aware of our next door neighbours who lived directly across the road. Their house and our house are located across from each other, and we are each other's only direct neighbours. Here lived an older couple with their sole daughter, Sandra. The couple were strange and never seemed to leave the house much. They rarely interacted with my family or my parents, rendering our relationship with them pretty much non-existent. Sandra was in her late teens to early 20s when I was a child, and I was always scared of her. She had long, black, usually greasy hair and pasty skin. She rarely left the house and had an aura which felt unhinged and unpredictable. These feelings were enhanced by the actions and stories I was told about her by my family. Keep in mind, this story begins in 80s Ireland when kids were allowed to roam free a lot more than now. My eldest sister Mary was the one who experienced the most negative encounters with her. When she was young, Sandra took a particular interest in her and always tried to chalk up a friendship with her. Sandra would have been 4 to 5 years older. My sister Mary would entertain these interests to an extent, mainly out of politeness, but it was always met with another reason to be freaked out by Sandra. It started when Mary used to wait for the bus at the end of our gate in the mornings. Sandra rarely attended school, as it seemed her parents had no control over her. When she would spot my sister waiting for the bus, she would open her window ajar and turn on heavy screamo metal music to try and scare my sister. Mary recalls that she'd turn on the music, she'd part her bedroom curtains slightly, and would catch Sandra smiling and seemingly taking delight in making my sister uncomfortable. You may think, what's the harm in some metal music in the morning? but keep in mind this was taking place at 7 o'clock in the morning on misty, dark, cold, desolate Irish mornings as a young girl waited by herself for her bus. My sister recalls that once her bus finally turned up, Sandra lowered the music and closed the curtains. This continued for weeks, until my mother noticed my sister becoming so reluctant and scared to get to the bus by herself before she could finally get out of her what was going on. So my sister and mother stood at the bus stop every morning from then on, with my mother's arms crossed, staring at Sandra's window, which stopped the music playing pretty quickly. The freakish nature of Sandra started to ramp up as more time went on. The summer of the same year, Mary ended up spending an extra odd day here and there with Sandra due to the lack of variety of people to hang out with in rural Ireland and the lengthy nature of school summer holidays. One day, Sandra convinced my sister to come into her house. My sister recalls the house being pretty normal up until entering Sandra's bedroom. The room was dimly lit, and a pang of mustiness that my sister knew our mother would kill us over if our rooms were kept in the same condition. The walls were covered in graphic posters of devilish-themed metal bands and gory computer games of the time, such as Mortal Kombat. Mary felt uneasy the whole time there, but also curious to see behind these walls that my family spent hours conjuring up stories of the over-exaggerated possibilities that laid behind them. After a while, Sandra offered to play a Ouija board with my sister. Mary had no clue what this was and said, yeah, why not? She noticed the whole time Sandra kept her gaze on her as much as she could and seemed to get pleasure in knowing my sister was uncomfortable. My sister was disappointed with the lack of fun or action in this so-called game and eventually up and left to head home. Sandra convinced my sister to call over a couple more times that summer and continuously pressed to play this Ouija board game. My mother started to become more concerned as Mary bizarrely started to ask questions about human and animal sacrifice. She pressed my sister on why and where she had heard of these things, and my sister revealed that Sandra had books on these topics as well as the occult, and she'd been showing them and lending them to my sister. As you can imagine, this most certainly did not go down well with my mother. She marched across the road still with her apron still on from cooking the dinner and firmly knocked on our neighbor's door. After a stern conversation and a notification that Sandra was not to come near her children again, Sandra seemed to take glee in the trouble that she had caused and happily told my mother that she'd also performed multiple Ouija board sessions with my sister and that she hoped a demon now possessed my sister. That sealed the deal, and our neighbors were officially blacklisted within my house. A couple years later, I came along, and stories such as these and many others not mentioned circulated my childhood to reinforce the ban on ever going near their house. Sandra seemed nightmarish to me, and I feared the sight of her. She became more deranged as the years went on and supposedly even caused a split in the marriage of her parents. If the story ended here, I guess it would be a pretty tame story, about a kind of freaky neighbor and no more. But that is not the case. Sandra burst back into our lives one night in an almost comical way that mirrored that of a horror movie. I was 21 by this stage, and Sandra was nothing more than a scary figure from my childhood that seemed more a part of local lore than actual reality. It was a particularly gloomy autumn night in 2015. There was a blustery wind and heavy rainfall. It seemed fitting in the lead up to Halloween. By this stage, it was just me, my brother, who has special needs, and my niece living at home with my parents. This particular night, my dad was on a business trip to England, so it was just the rest of us at home. Over the years, there had been 2 car accidents outside my house, as it's situated on a dangerous bend on the road, causing the death of 3 people. The bend has been reconstructed since. At around 2 a.m. this night, I was awoken by a scream from outside our front door. I shot up on my bed and my mind immediately raced to the thought that there had been another accident. I heard another wail and my heart started to race as I ran down my stairs in a flash. As I reached the hallway and turned to the front door, I was met with a face staring through the window pane, and it was one that I will never forget. Her hair had gotten thinner and seemed patchy on her head. Her cheeks were sunken in, and her eyes looked deranged. It was like she was looking right through me. She began repeatedly calling out my parents' name. By this stage, the shock of the situation had slightly worn off, and I realized I had a complete stranger screaming at me through the door. I cautiously asked who she was and what was wrong, but she just kept screaming my parents' names over and over like she was possessed. I slightly opened the door, as I wasn't sure if she could hear me or properly see me, as she seemed to have a glassed over look in her eyes. Once the door slightly opened, she pushed through and grabbed my arm. She started shouting my older brother's name now, who she must have thought I was. I tried to calm her, but to no avail, and managed to backtrack upstairs to get my mother. When I got to her room, she was already up, and as I began to explain what was happening, she stopped me and just said, "Sandra." I followed my ma'am downstairs and watched in horror as Sandra dropped to the floor at the sight of my mother. She now began wailing about her dog and how it was in trouble. By this stage, the smell of her began to become obvious and was obnoxiously filling the room. It smelt like a mix of weed and alcohol. Sandra began to become more coherent in her speech and tried to explain that her dog was being trapped in her car by her boyfriend. She kept screaming over and over that her dog was going to die, and if she went back down, her boyfriend would beat her too. Seeing this all unfold was so unsettling, as well as seeing my now older mother trying to handle it. By this stage, we began to hear calling from outside the door. I walked over and peered out and could see the silhouette of an elderly male figure slowly dragging himself up our driveway. He was calling out Sandra's name, and as he got closer, we realized it was her elderly father, who we had not seen in years. He seemed agitated, but also embarrassed by Sandra's behavior. We never found out if Sandra's boyfriend was doing what she claimed he had been doing, as her father started to drag her away while apologizing for disturbing us. As he dragged her reluctantly down the driveway, she repeatedly called out my parents' name while screaming for help. The night sort of just wound down from there, and we never really found out what happened. We haven't heard or seen from Sandra since that night, but we did sadly hear that her father passed away recently. There have been many more stories of things that Sandra did to my family over the years that I didn't mention, some of which include lying and creating stories trying to get us in trouble with the guards, Irish police. I can discuss more in the comments if people are interested. Either way, I hope me and my family never encounter more trouble from this woman again. A huge thank you to Andy Tate for collaborating with me on these stories. It was an absolute pleasure. We'll be definitely doing this again. And, just so you know, you can listen to Andy on any podcasting platform that you use, or if you search Let's Not Meet Podcast, Andy Tate's website will appear. And what I'll do is actually add his website in my episode description to make it even easier to find him. So happy listening, you creepy listeners. Now, tomorrow is a Friday and I haven't done any shoutouts, so I'll have a little surprise story for you plus shoutouts for you awesome listeners. And I wanted to take this opportunity to say, happy birthday, Mum. Who's, data expunged, years young. Love you. And I'll have copious amounts of tea in your honor. Also, you brilliant listeners, if you have stories of your own, be sure to send them my way at storiesfablesghostlytales@gmail.com. Before I sign off, I've been getting feedback on the old time radio shows, and it's pretty clear to me that the first one I uploaded wasn't that good quality. The story was great, but the audio is hard to hear, whilst the second story listeners seem to really enjoy it. So I'm going to spend some time identifying the ones that are worth my listeners' time, both regarding from an interesting plot perspective as well as an audio quality perspective. I always keep you listeners in the forefront of what I share. So although I loved the first story, it just didn't have that quality of audio that everyone could hear easily. So this will significantly improve the kind of episodes I upload regarding old time radio. So thanks a lot for letting me know what you guys and gals thought. It's really helped. So thank you all for listening, and stay tuned to tomorrow's episode where I share a story that's definitely different. Oh, and it's Mortis Media Week. So if you get a chance, hop onto YouTube, search for Mortis Media, and you'll find loads of stories from narrators like me. It's a great hub for creepy, scary stories to listen to in the dark. So, enjoy. And on that note, it is that time. This is the place where stories live, and you telltellers come to listen. Enjoy your day or night, and join me every weekday for our creepy tradition. And as always, till next time.